Okay, so moving on now to Toontrack's EZKeys. We'll spend a few tutorials looking at how it works. It's similar in functionality to EZDrummer, but with one major difference: the user interface. It's tiny, and it can't be altered. I'm not going to go into the same sort of level of detail with EZKeys as I did with EZDrummer, simply because they share a very similar workflow and the way things are structured, albeit one is for drums and one is for keyboards. And as we progress, we'll see that EZBass too follows the same structure. Anyway, let's take a tour first of all of EZKeys to get set up and familiarise ourselves where functions are located. As we would expect, we get the ubiquitous menu options at the top left for new and open, save, etc. We'll look at ensuring the audio output is set in a moment. In fact, I may as well do that now. Under Settings, select the top option, Audio/MIDI Setup. You'll need to set this so that your sound card, whichever one that you've got, is activated for the audio and the MIDI playback, and indeed for any MIDI recording into EZKeys. Anyway, obviously you would choose your sound card from the drop-down list and set the output channels appropriately. No doubt you'll have to refer to your sound card manual if you're not sure how to do this, but ordinarily this is usually set to output 1 and 2. Though I do have a Focusrite I use on one of my PCs that uses, somewhat bizarrely, outputs 3 and 4 as the main outputs. So as I say, you'll have to check yours. Anyway, now let's take a user interface tour. I'll return to the library option in a moment. First, notice this option. Click on it to lift the lid, where you can adapt the dynamics. Now, to be honest, I would leave this set to the default MIDI note values of 1, 2, 7 for the highest notes, or the loudest, and 1 for the lowest. There's an option there that you can activate for the soft note function if you prefer to use that. Now, over at the right, we would click on this to lift the tuning options. Again, I'm going to leave at the default here. But you would use this, perhaps, if you are playing along to a live recording that wasn't actually recorded at concert pitch. So you would be able to adapt the tuning here using this so that EZKeys runs in tune with that live recording. Anyway, let's go back to the top for the library, and we will click to reveal here to see a list of presently installed keyboards and, of course, the related sound samples. Now this is equivalent to the EZDrummer sound library. Remember, with EZDrummer you would load a kit and that contains all the different samples. Well, that's the same here. We would load up a particular keyboard, generally a piano, but there are different ones, synths and harps and, can't remember now, a few different ones, but generally they are pianos. Now obviously, clicking here you can select a different sound library to switch over from the grand piano, the default, to whatever you've bought and got loaded up. And as we would expect, whichever one that we do have loaded, we can hear it by clicking on the animated keyboard below. Okay, so that's the grand piano. Now here's one of the other extensions that I've bought. This is the hybrid harp. Have a quick listen. Okay, and an upright piano. Okay, well, kind of a similar sound to the grand, but there are obvious sonic differences. Anyway, I'll go back to the grand piano. You'll notice that, dependent on how large the sample library for each separate expansion, you'll see the red loading progress bar here. These don't tend to take as long loading up as EZDrummer. Then moving along, we see various presets for each separate library. These are the grand piano presets that adapt the sound with various tonal adjustments and effect settings. As we flick through some, check the 4 dials at the bottom left adapt to help create that particular preset sound. Okay, now to be honest, there's not masses of change between the sounds, and I tend to only use EZKeys to generate the MIDI patterns I require, and then, within my DAW, I get a different VSTI to generate or output the actual sampled piano. I love the way that EZKeys works, but I'm not, to be honest, totally convinced, or totally enamoured would probably be a better word, with the samples. Anyway, each to their own, some people love them. At the far top right, we can open this menu button, and here it offers us various options. Now I think they pretty much textually speak for themselves. And obviously, similar to EZDrummer and EZBass, we would zoom in and out with the option down here. Now at the moment I haven't got a pattern on the timeline, either one that I've created or one that I've brought in from the various expansions I've bought. Now one way to use EZKeys is to add in a chord progression that you have for your song. To do that, you would add placeholder chords initially, and then use the chord finder option that we'll look at in a moment, or maybe in the next tutorial or two, to swap the placeholder chords to the ones for our song. So to add placeholder chords, click this button, and that now adds a C major chord by default. I'll just click on the play button to hear it. Okay, not much to say about it, it's a C major. Anyway, I'm going to zoom in slightly and use the next button down, the scissors or split tool. Using this, I can click on the existing C major chord, that placeholder, to create two versions of C major, now at 2 measures each of the original 1 bar of that C major chord. If you want to remove a chord, no surprises, right click and choose remove. I'll remove that second one there, that second C major. Incidentally, using this third tool adds a separation of the C major without splitting it into 2 chords like we saw with the split tool. We now see 1 chord, but the C major there is listed twice, but as I say, it's covering 1 actual chord. As seen before, when swapping presets, we get these 4 parameter dials: tone, detail, reverb, and compression. You can adapt them to tailor the sound that EZKeys generates. I'll increase the reverb and take a listen, and I'll increase fully now to 100% and take another listen. A little bit too much for my taste, so I'll take it back to around about 20%. The compression dial reduces the dynamic range, so the loudest notes and the quietest notes aren't so far apart, and this can be good for a pop piano sound. Not great for a classical piano, where quite a high degree of dynamics is preferred. Anyway, this is what this sounds like. Okay, now here is the loop button. Activated, it displays red just above the chords. You can adapt this to suit, left click and drag to extend it or reduce it. Now at the moment the placeholder chords are C major. If you want to swap the key, click here and change. For this example, I'll swap it to D flat or C sharp, call it what you will, and we'll have a quick listen. You can adapt the time signature here, and of course the tempo. By the way, if you prefer to record yourself directly into EZKeys, rather than using the browser patterns, you'll likely want a metronome click to keep you in time. Well, clicking here activates the metronome, and we'll just take a quick listen to those chords now with that clicking. Okay, now that's too loud for me, so let's adjust the volume of the metronome. To do this, you might have spotted it earlier, come up to settings and then choose metronome settings, and this dialog opens up. Now I'd suggest the self-explanatory text for all the options here informs us of the parameter settings. I'm going to reduce the volume level of the first beat and the other beats as well. Let's have a listen. Okay, it's still a bit too loud, so I'll reduce again and take another listen. Okay, that's better. Speaking of volume, to adapt the general playback volume, use this large dial. Okay, now I'm going to pause here and we'll continue having a look around the user interface in the next one. See you in a second. Okay, so picking up on our initial tour of the EZKeys user interface, down at the right of the timeline area where we place chord blocks is where we find the ruler options. At present it's set to display bars and beats like this as a straight display, but you can click here to change the ruler to reflect triplets. I'll return it to the straight option. And just below we get these in and out zoom buttons. Clicking them zooms us in or out, of course, of the chords on the timeline. Below those are these left and right scroll buttons that moves the focus by increments rather than free-form dragging. Most importantly, we see the browser button that opens into view all the chord structure patterns that you get installed with your keyboard libraries, or from extra MIDI packs that contain only that, MIDI sequences, with no sampled sounds. They all work to generate keyboard-driven chord sequences though, with whatever library that you have loaded up. Above at the left, we see a column that the user can populate with patterns that have been favorited. The next 4 columns to the right work exactly like EZDrummer in that they are hierarchical and filter to the right through the remaining columns until you find a chord sequence that you like. The important thing to do is listen to the patterns and ascertain if the playing style will fit your song and its chord structure. The playback of these patterns and their chord sequences when auditioning will not bear any relation to your chord sequence. So what we need to focus on is the actual style. I'll try some out. Here goes. So, despite the chords played being unrelated to your chord sequence, you should be able to decide if it's suitable for your song by the way the progression was played. Obviously, the category columns do help you decide initially if the style will be suitable. The extra MIDI packs, the add-on packs as they are called, of sequences are sold as specific types of music, different genres, etc. So that helps too. You'll have noticed all the patterns that we heard played at the same tempo, the tempo set below, 120 BPM. We can force the sequences to play at the tempo they were originally recorded by checking the Preview in Original Tempo box above. We'll do that another time. You can see the suggested tempos in the penultimate column. You'll see folders names such as What Goes Around, 75 BPM, for example, or Feeling Cold, 68 BPM. Now, of course, you don't have to stick to those tempos. They are just suggestions based on the actual recorded tempo. Another way to adapt the tempo set by the global tempo, here set at 120 BPM, is to use the functionality similar to what we saw in EZDrummer. At present, all the patterns play at the normal speed, but you'll see we can play them at half speed or double speed. Let's try that. Okay, I'll return to normal speed, and we'll conclude here for this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one. So we've now got EZKeys running, and I've got it running in standalone mode. And just quickly so that we see the expansion that I've just bought, if we come up here to where it says library at the moment, by default we're going to get the grand piano loading up. I think the grand piano is the default because when you initially buy EZKeys, and this is probably why I don't really remember, it's been years since I bought EZKeys, and in fact just by looking at the footprint of the user interface you can see that it's desperately in need of an upgrade. It isn't expandable, we can't enlarge it or reduce its size. If you go on any of the Toontrack forums, you're going to see hundreds and hundreds of people pleading, come on, let's have an EZKeys too, so that we can have a larger footprint. Anyway, until they do that, we're going to have to live with what we've got. And what we have is the library with the grand piano. But if I click on here, you can see the other ones that I've got installed. There's the electronic pop that I've just purchased. And we see a different keyboard there, of course. The graphic now is a synthesizer. And this works like all the other EZKeys products, EZBass, EZDrummer, Superior Drummer, in that it's animated. If I just go back to the grand piano, as soon as I click on any of these notes, you'll hear it. So that A there, we hear. And also, if you notice up here, you'll see the actual text for the name itself. And because I'm only clicking on single notes here, we only see single notes up there. Once we start playing back patterns using song blocks down here, in much the same way as we have done with EZDrummer, then you'll see any chords that get played will display up here as well. In fact, if I just come down and add a couple of chords by clicking on here, 8 chords there, they all come in as C major initially, but we can swap those simply by clicking on the first chord there, for example. I'll change that to an A minor. The second chord, I want that to be an E minor, and as soon as I select here in a second on this wheel of chords, circle of fifths, then you'll see that E minor registers up there. Actually, I'm wrong. I thought it did. During playback it will. Perhaps during input it clearly doesn't. My third chord I want to be an F, but I want it to be an F major 7th. And the fourth chord I want to be a C, but a C major 7th. Now I want a D minor 7th and a G 7th. And in fact I don't actually need that final C chord there. So I'll right click on it and remove. So this is what we've got at the present time. I'll just loop around that. I was wrong. I did want that C there for the pattern. In fact, that needs to stretch out. So that will just be a normal C. I might make that a sus2 there. So I would need to split. I could either reduce the length or, going back to where we were, using the scissor tool there, we can split there. And I'll make that final version a C. Well, we've got sus4. I actually want it to be a C sus2, so I'll take away the third from there. Let me go back and listen. I'll just extend the looping area. Okay, so that's the chord pattern, the chord progression that I want to work with. So for the moment, we'll leave it here. Rather than having EZKeys forgetting this though, if we just conclude by coming to File and then clicking on Save, and then you can save that particular EZKeys progression wherever you prefer on your system. Well, I want it to be in this folder here, so I'll give it a name. No words as of yet, and I'll click on Save. So now I am quite happy to close down EZKeys because I can always recall this no words project that we've got saved. Okay, right, I'll see you in a moment. Okay, now you'll remember that we left off in the previous tutorial looking at this chord sequence that I've written in, and the last chord here, well, it kind of changed from a C major, and I was looking for a C suspended second. But if you remember, whenever we click on any of these chords, we open up the chord wheel so that we can add in whatever chord that we like. But in this case, even if I go to the details here, I couldn't find a C suspended second, and that's the chord that I actually want for this. So the next best thing that I could think of doing was taking away the third. Okay? And whenever, you'll notice that whenever you change anything here, it will play that chord for you in the background. So that's taking away the third note there. But that's not really what I wanted to do, so let me just add that back in again. Because it's not really a suspended second, just taking away the third. Taking away the E, the note E, in a C major, doesn't make the chord a C suspended second. So what we really need to do, and we kind of glanced at this in a previous tutorial, if we use this tool here, third one down, select it, and then come over to the last part of this C major chord, remember it plays it twice there. If I just click there, I can then now choose to adjust the chord analysis to something else, or remove the chord divider. Well, I want that first option. I don't want a major, I don't want a minor. So if I come down to type, then you'll see that I get all these different options now. And within here, hooray, we get a suspended second chord. So I'll choose that. And as a consequence, if I just deselect that tool by clicking on the pointer tool, as a consequence, we now see the C suspended second is there. So let's have a playback and hear what it sounds like. Okay, so that's what I actually want. I want it to merge, or rather flow, from C major to a C suspended second there. Okay, so that's what we can do when we use this tool. Right, we'll leave it here and I'll see you in a moment. Right, let's pick up again. Well, you can see that I've got my chord sequence here once more, rather than when we previously saw it here in Cubase running along the EZKeys MIDI track here. I've actually left it so that we hear it here within EZKeys, down in the song block track area running here. This is following the host. Make sure that you do have it following the host, otherwise they won't synchronize, of course. So now that we're here, let's check out what we can do to customize the sequence even further prior to sending our composition into a DAW such as Cubase. Now, you don't have to export the EZKeys piano pattern to your DAW. Certainly, if you like the pattern and think it works exactly as it is. Really, there's no need to drag this pattern up onto the Cubase track up here. However, in my experience, it's never that easy or simple though. The pattern that we get generated within our browser, the pattern that we get, or the sequence shall I say, blended in with our chords, never works out precisely or exactly as we want it. Well, apart from swapping or changing to a different pattern from within EZKeys, within the browser library here, apart from doing that, you can't really do any fine note-by-note editing within EZKeys. So as a result, to be able to edit specific notes, you will need to export the MIDI pattern to your DAW, and then take advantage of the MIDI editing tools that your DAW, in this case Cubase, offers to us. Now, that's not to say there are no methods of modification available to us in EZKeys. There are a couple of things that we can do, though to be fair, they are quite rudimental. And this is why Toontrack EZKeys users have been begging for an update to the software that will align it more with EZdrummer and EZBass, both of which do possess extensive internal editing options. Anyway, until EZKeys is updated, I'll show you what you can do. Obviously, you can flavour the chords that you have used in your sequence by calling up the chord finder chooser. So for example, with this A minor, I could turn this A minor into an A minor 7th. Okay, and we get to hear just that section until we move into the E minor. Incidentally, if you don't want to audition or hear that every time that you change a chord, then just click on here, this audition button. So clicking on there to deactivate it will silence the audible audition. Anyway, I'm going to go back and I'll change that A minor 7, maybe without the 7th. Just make it an A minor rather. I nearly said E minor. That's because that second chord is E minor. Maybe you could make that an E minor 7. So those are a couple of things that we can do. We can use the wheel here of all the different chords. Further details, remember, by clicking on here to modify what we've got. Something else that we can do, although as I say it's quite rudimentary, is with the pattern right click and then choose that bottom option, properties, and there you'll see in this case this particular sequence has been set as a verse, but that's not really MIDI editing. We can change it of course, and it takes on that green color there as a bounding box. I'll take it back to verse. That's not really MIDI editing, but that's one thing we can do from here. But we can change the octave by clicking there, and notice as you click up and down there, increasing the octave, then the MIDI note representation down here, going up an octave there. I'll take it back. We can transpose to a different key, going up or down by a semitone each. Well, I don't really want to change the key, so that's not really all that valuable to me. So really all we can do to be able to modify this is to drag it up onto the timeline. So I'll do that in a second. Let's just have a quick listen. Here we go. You can change the chords here as we progress, say this G7 for example. Swap the G7. It stutters a little bit whilst you do it. Well, depends on how powerful your machine is. I'll change that back to a G7. Okay, sort of a little staccato feel as the buffer tries to catch up. So that's what we can do when we want to play this back and listen to it, but it doesn't really help, does it? So as we know, all we do is left click and drag up onto the timeline here, so that we place a direct copy of this onto our EZKeys track. We will have to mute this or switch this follow host option off. I'll leave it on. Instead, right click and then mute that. You could remove it if you want to, but I want to keep it. And therefore now when we play this, we can hear it being played from within Cubase here, as opposed to being duplicated or being played directly from here. If we try to play the two together, we would get not only an increase in volume, well, a considerable increase in volume because we're doubling it up, but we will start getting phasing issues, I'm sure. Anyway, that's a quick run through what we can do when we want to edit our MIDI down here. As I say, there's not really much we can do with this. Right clicking doesn't really give us much of an option. We could quantize if we want to, we could randomize the chords, but again, that's not really helping. Right, we'll leave it here and we'll pick up again in the following tutorial. During the previous tutorial, I said there was no real way, or at least no straightforward way in EZKeys, of editing the MIDI performance, the MIDI sequence that you drag down to the timeline from the browser. Well, I would like to show you a method now that I use that allows me to adapt a sequence of my own, a chord sequence, to get a different performance than one gained by accepting a browser pattern in its entirety. So rather than just one of the patterns from many of these separate categories that we have, I'm going to use a combination of different patterns that I like, or perhaps prefer the sound of, in terms of the performance. I'll switch over to the browser first of all. Now at the moment I haven't got any sequence on the timeline, and this is why I want to use a new pattern to begin with. I've already found one that I want to use to begin my process. It can be found here in the Ballads No. 2 MIDI library. And then, moving across through these subcategories, I'm going to choose straight 4/4 and then to the 80s mellow 62 BPM one there. And finally, out of the 4 options presented to me, I'm going to choose the third one down, called Variation No. 3, not unsurprisingly. Now of course, with it having a tempo of 62 BPM, but with EZKeys running at the much higher tempo, almost double, at 120 BPM, playing this with the audition button plays the track much faster than I want it to be played. Okay, now obviously if I want to audition this at the original tempo of 62 BPM, then I will check here, where it's labelled Preview in Original Tempo. Let's hear it. Okay, that's better at that tempo, although when I utilise it in a moment, it will be a tiny bit slower, a fraction slower, at 60 BPM. Well, effectively anyway, seeing as the tempo, the master tempo, is running at 120 BPM, and I will utilise the pattern on the timeline, this variation No. 3, at half its tempo. So, running at half tempo, I'll drag this variation No. 3 down onto the timeline. And of course now we see a sequence with a number of different chords that bear no relation to the chord pattern or the chord sequence that I want to use. This is what it sounds like. Okay, so what I will do is, well, I'm going to stop talking and let you watch me go through the process of substituting the chords from this original pattern into the chords I want to use for the song that I am composing. And of course I'm only going to use the minimum amount of tools available to me, the ones that we have seen so far. Using the split tool and the separation tool allow me to adapt the chords as necessary to tailor the performance so that it plays the pattern that I've written. Now as I work my way through adapting the sequence, I will split the block to chord level and substitute ones I don't feel work in the context of the pattern. You'll see therefore that we are not restricted to using only one of the patterns for a composition's chord sequence. We can utilise smaller performance sections from multiple patterns that we have available in our library. Anyway, as I say, I'll stop talking so that you can concentrate more on my method of building a composite sequence like this. Here we go. Write a useful way of utilizing smaller performance sections from multiple patterns that we have available in our library. Let's move on. I want to give you some further information about the browser here. You'll see that I've got many of the extra packs, the extra MIDI packs that I've bought over the years and labelled as add-on packs. You might need to scroll down to see them all, the more that you buy. But as EZKeys ships out to you, digitally ships out, we get these two categories under the MIDI libraries header, EZKeys MIDI and Music Theory Examples. You can use either, of course. And then, once we've done that, as soon as we work our way across the browser into the next 3 columns that incrementally narrow down the patterns based on the specific folders that you selected on your journey across from left to right, we end up with the actual MIDI files themselves. In other words, once you get to the last column, the one on the right, you're presented with a number of variations of the same patterns that grow in complexity from top to bottom. Now, I think this is useful in terms of what I've said previously about not having an integrated MIDI editor, because you could select the least complex versions of the patterns for some sections of your song, the verses for example, and then utilize the more complex patterns for the chorus or bridge, etc. You could even increase the complexity of each verse as you progress, starting on the least complex for verse 1, going to verse 2, the second variation, etc, etc. You get the idea, I'm sure. Now oftentimes, as I'm sure you've noticed, the parent folder for the patterns are labelled for things like intro or verse, chorus, bridge, etc. Good starting points, but you can of course break the suggested rules and use a chorus pattern for an intro if you want. Anyway, however you decide to use the patterns, you'll undoubtedly find some that you like more than others. You'll have favourites. Well, to save you the issue of having to remember which they were, whichever pattern you choose, you can drag the specific pattern across to the first column, the My Favourites column. And just as soon as you do, you'll see it gets listed in the section below for easy access. Noticeably though, you don't get any connected information about the pattern in terms of where it originally derived in relation to the original folder, or even the tempo or the style or the song components, verse, chorus, etc. Though there is a way to find the containing folder. Just right click on the file in the Favorites area and then choose Show in Browser, and that will automatically take you to the folder that the MIDI file comes from. Anyway, another way to get around this lack of detail though is that you can create your own folder in the My Favorites section. To do this, simply right-click on the My Favorites section and choose to create a new folder, and then rename it with a label that helps you recognize it. I'll call it No Words, the name of the composition that I'm working on, though you might not see the file now because you've got the No Words folder selected, so you'll need to drag the MIDI file that you've placed in My Favorites into the No Words folder. Just drag and drop. Now what I tend to do from this point is name a new folder after the song name as we've seen, and then inside that create a subfolder that gets labelled something like verse 116 BPM, for example. You will then need to drag the pattern into that newly created verse 116 BPM folder. By the way, another way to add a folder is go to the menu button at the top right and choose Browser, and then Add Folder to Browser. And you would go through the same hierarchical structure of naming folders, etc., the conventional way. Okay, quite simple really, but I wanted to point this out to you so that you can see my way of working, and so you can adopt that way of working or completely ignore it, and that's up to you. Anyway, we'll leave it here, and we'll progress once again. We'll now look at the ostensibly simple process of importing MIDI files into EZKeys. To be fair, importing MIDI files into EZKeys is pretty straightforward. It's the different types of MIDI file I want to discuss here, and how EZKeys reacts with different option prompts dependent on the type chosen. So here is EZKeys running, but without any pattern on the timeline. We're going to import 3 different MIDI files at different times that I created in Cubase to see what happens here in EZKeys. To import a MIDI file is simple enough. Go to your menu button and choose the last option called Song Track, Fly out and then choose Import MIDI file. Once you've navigated to the relevant folder on your system where the particular MIDI file is located, then choose appropriately. As you can see, there are the 3 MIDI files I'm going to import individually to illustrate the differences between them. I'll select the one labelled piano first of all. This MIDI file, as it suggests, is of the piano sequence that we've heard a few times previously. Once I select Open, we see this Import MIDI file dialog. We get a couple of options to help make the MIDI performance more human sounding and to transpose the key if required. Clicking Details there reveals extra information about the transpose option. Now I won't be overriding with this option, and click Import to slot the file on the timeline. You'll notice there is a bar of silence at the start of the pattern. Now this is simply because I exported the MIDI file from Cubase starting at bar 2. Obviously you can trim away that silence if you like. Let's check it out. As I say, you have heard this sequence previously quite a number of times. Anyway, here we go. Right, that's the piano MIDI file on its own. I'll remove it by right-clicking and deleting. Let's look at the other 2 MIDI file options now. So, back to the menu button and down to Song Track once more, where I'll choose the Import MIDI file option again. The middle file of the 3 is labelled Drums, Bass, Keys. This is a combination MIDI file created in Cubase that features MIDI patterns from EZDrummer, EZBass and EZKeys. Before importing it, notice the MIDI file option above is labelled the same way, but with one difference. It states Type 0 at the end of the file name. I'll come back to this in a moment. For now, let's select the middle file and hit Open. OK, well, we now see a different dialog to what we saw when the MIDI file only contained the piano information. Here, because the MIDI file is a combination of 3 instruments, drums, bass and piano, we can choose which instruments or instrument element to import. If you want to audition the instruments prior to making your import choice, use the preview button below once you have selected an instrument above. Here's the piano on its own. OK, and here's the bass on its own. OK, so that was the bass pattern. However, it was played here using the Grand Piano library loaded up. Obviously, EZKeys won't reproduce the same bass line and samples as originally created in EZBass. Anyway, let's select the bass part and open it, and we now see that EZBass created bass MIDI file here in EZKeys. Now, to be honest, I think EZKeys has struggled a little analysing the chord structure. Though, to be fair, all it had to go on was single bass note runs rather than chords. And playing it now shows the difference in the way EZBass and EZKeys generates bass MIDI files. Have a listen. Not great. Anyway, let's remove it from the timeline, and we'll go back to the last MIDI file option that I created in Cubase, this Type 0 file. A Type 0 MIDI file is similar to the multi-instrument MIDI file just seen, but it has one big difference. A Type 0 MIDI file merges all the instrument notes together into one MIDI file. There won't be the option in a moment to import instrument elements from the file. Anyway, I'll select it and hit Open. As a result, we see the same Import MIDI file dialog as we saw when we imported the piano file on its own. This dialog opens here because the Type 0 MIDI file is effectively one file. With this being a combination of drums, bass and piano, it will sound terrible, but let's try it. Here we go. As I said, it's a mess of notes, and exacerbated by a third of the notes originally being drum strikes that EZKeys is now trying to reproduce as piano notes. You might wonder, therefore, if Type 0 MIDI files have any place in your composition process. Well, they can if used sensibly. Perhaps you are not the best piano player in the world and recorded the bass piano notes on their own track in your DAW prior to playing the chord structure as simple triads on a separate track before finishing up with adding melody line notes on another MIDI track. Well, by exporting the MIDI file as type 0, you get a combination of the three parts as one single file that you can import conveniently into EZKeys. That said, I think I would still export the three parts as a multi-MIDI file, but not type 0, because you'll remember we got the option to choose the individual MIDI track components on their own, or as a combination of tracks. Anyway, that's the difference between the different types of MIDI file that you can import into EZKeys.